To the war in Ukraine, which European leaders are discussing today at a meeting in Brussels. But the future of the US financial support for the war has become uncertain after Defence Secretary Pete Hegseth called for NATO countries to increase their spending and take the lead in providing for Ukraine's security. A short time ago, he spoke to reporters ahead of the NATO ministers' meeting.
As I said to our allies yesterday, we recognize the incredible commitment that has been made over many years, and no country, as the President Trump has pointed out, has made a larger commitment to the Ukrainian mission than the United States of America, north of $300 billion. So the United States has invested in stabilizing those front lines after the aggression of Russia. There is no betrayal there. There is a recognition that the whole world and the United States is invested and interested in peace.
And for more, we are joined by a Professor of Government at the University of Essex, Natasha Lindstaedt. Natasha, great to have you on the program once again. Now, we just heard there from Pete Hegseth, but what's the feeling in Europe about a big shift in U.S. policy, one of them being the Trump administration's, quote, unrealistic prospect of Ukraine reclaiming territory pre-2014 when Crimea was annexed?
Right. Well, European leaders understand that they cannot count on the U.S. They cannot count on Trump in any way, whether it be the fact that, Trump is probably going to launch tariffs on Europe. That's one problem. But also that Trump doesn't care about providing military support to Ukraine and that they're going to have to do that themselves. They had met, the foreign ministers of several European countries met in Paris a few days ago, and they had agreed that they want to ramp up support for Ukraine, that they are more resolute in their backing of Ukraine, understanding the consequences of not doing so, that this will lead to greater Russian encroachment and will embolden Russia to possibly attack other countries. So leaders like French President Emmanuel Macron have been saying this for some time now, that they cannot rely on the U.S. security umbrella and need to be more self-sufficient, but particularly because U.S. politics has been so volatile lately, and there isn't a consistent style of foreign policy leadership that European leaders in the past have relied upon.
Yes, and do European countries have the capacity then to increase their involvement with Ukraine, provide the defenses that Ukraine needs, but also the rest of Europe needs against Russia? And what's the mechanism for that? I mean, the US is part of NATO, but how else can European nations come together and have a mechanism to be able to provide that sort of military support?
So European leaders, if they are committed, should have enough resources to basically maintain a stalemate. I don't think that they have enough to overturn the way the conflict is going and for Ukraine to actually somehow win this conflict. But they have enough to keep things going, to maintain some kind of stalemate, to stall. And what the hope would be that Russia would bleed out so many soldiers that they wouldn't be able to maintain it, and then that they could get to the negotiation table. And the result would be a peace agreement that would be more favorable to Ukraine. At the moment, what Trump is angling for is a peace agreement that would be incredibly favorable to Russia.
And what sort of message does that send, to the world when we are in a position where the U.S. is, as you say, and as our former defense minister had mentioned earlier in our program, that, possibly he was appeasing Moscow. So what sort of message do you think Donald Trump is sending to Vladimir Putin in the context of ending this war in Ukraine?
Well, he's actually sending a very clear message, because Putin had been isolated diplomatically for years, and that's no longer the case. He's sending a message that he wants to resolve the war in Ukraine very quickly, and on grounds that would be very, very favorable to Russia, as I already mentioned. I mean, one of the things that he had said, Trump had said on Fox News the other day, he said Ukrainians may be Russian one day, which was a crazy thing to say. And he said that they, started the peace talks with Russia, and that, as Pete Hegseth, the Secretary of Defense, had mentioned, it's very unlikely that Ukraine will be able to maintain its sovereignty, that Russia already has 20% of its territory, mostly in the east, and that Trump would push the Ukrainians into accepting this type of deal, or would try to push the Ukrainians to hold elections where some sort of puppet government that's pro-Russian would get elected. But none of these terms are favorable to Ukraine. You see that Ukraine doesn't really have a lot of leverage. It's so dependent on U.S. aid and, of course, on European aid. And that's just sort of to kind of keep their head above water. But one of the more recent signals that Trump has been sending that is worrisome for Ukraine is the group of individuals that are being sent to negotiate. He's sending Secretary of State Marco Rubio and National Security Advisor Michael Waltz. And instead of sending Special Envoy to Ukraine and Russia, Keith Kellogg, who's very pro-Ukraine, or at least more pro-Ukraine, he's sending Steve Witkoff, who is the Special Envoy to the Middle East. So he's sort of icing out his Special Envoy, Keith Kellogg, who would have been putting more pressure on Russia with more sanctions and trying to offer Ukraine more aid to get them to the negotiation table, which would then hopefully lead to a result that was more satisfactory to both parties.
And Natasha, do you believe that what the Trump administration is doing and its views on Ukraine is already having quite a big impact on Volodymyr Zelensky? Because he's now saying that, there could be a swap deal for Ukrainian-held territory in Russia, the Kursk region, in place for the land that they've lost so far.
So he's trying to apply pressure. Trump is trying to apply pressure on Zelensky for some kind of deal. One of the things that I had heard was that they were going to allow the U.S. to have access to basically Ukrainian precious minerals. But these are all in the east of Ukraine. And if Trump pushes Ukraine to cede that territory, there's no way Vladimir Putin would allow Trump and the U.S. to have access to these precious minerals there. So some of the things that Trump is saying are very contradictory. He's hoping to make some kind of deal with Ukraine, as you mentioned. There are talks of finding ways to, as Trump says, get back these millions of dollars that the U.S. has given Ukraine. But I think one of the things that Trump doesn't understand is these millions of dollars have basically gone to support U.S. companies that have producing various weapons and other forms of military support. And so because Trump is so transactional and he sees things as such, quid pro quo, and it doesn't understand the big picture, we have contradicting statements that are being made that they can't all both happen at the same time. You can't allow Ukraine to cede territory and then also have U.S. to be able to cultivate or take ownership out of these precious minerals that are part of eastern Ukraine.
And just briefly, Natasha, on Pete Hegseth, what he said, he was quite blunt in the presence of the NATO Secretary General, saying that Ukraine won't be granted NATO membership. But would that be music to Vladimir Putin's ears?
Exactly, and that's one of the things that Trump has made clear, that Ukraine joining NATO is not going to happen. He doesn't support that, and in fact, he says he understands why Putin feels so insecure and that he would put that on pause indefinitely. And that's exactly what one of Putin's red lines were. So he's playing into Putin's hands with this one as well.
Okay, Natasha Lindstaedt, always good to get your analysis. Thank you very much.
Thanks for having me.